Hello, everyone. How are you? My name is Urs Gasser, and I have the great pleasure to moderate this panel, this conversation on planetarized humanity. And immediately, my dear panelists and myself, we're facing at least 3 challenges. The first challenge, we're very aware that there was a session on sleep before, and so we hope you're all awake. The second challenge, of course, is that you may wonder, what is planetarized humanity? Rest assured, no one knows, we don't know, but that's a feature and not a bug. So we'll figure that out in the next 40 minutes. And the third challenge is, more seriously, the topics we're going to talk about, and we've heard it in the introduction already, are very serious. And at the same time, I always feel in such serious moments, it's also important to still have fun. And I promise you already, while the topic is serious, we have a fun panel, an amazing panel, and I'm really looking forward to covering a lot of ground in a short period of time. And, while the topic may sound abstract, I think it is very concrete and personal. And so if I might just start by feeling the temperature in the room. How many of you, and please show of hands, not quite yet, yeah. So, how many of you think AI is already shaping your lives, the way you make decisions, the way you work? How many of you? Please, a show of hands. All right. Thank you. Now, how many of you believe that advanced technologies, not only AI, but also quantum technology, neurotechnology, and the like, are going to fundamentally change our societies over the next 10, 25 years? Again, show of hands, please. All right, thank you. And last question is, how many of you think that our current institutions, whether it's governmental institutions, international organizations, policies and laws and regulations, are already ready to deal with the transformations we have ahead? Show of hands again.
0.
All right, here we go. I think that introduces the topic of our panel, this special moment that was mentioned by the GESDA president in his opening remarks, where we have, on the one hand side, extremely powerful technologies, science breakthroughs with lots of promise to build better futures, but then on the other hand, also a pile of global challenges, from climate to injustice to public health threats and the like, threats to democracy, not to forget. And all these dynamics at the same time seem to trigger a larger question and invite us to think about the larger question, and that is, how do we rethink what it means to be human? What kind of societal operating system do we need in this techno-driven future? And then, of course, doing so at a moment where, if I may say so, the planet is on fire, where we have to be seriously concerned how to preserve and maintain and sustain planetary health. So that's where it gets really serious. And so it's my great pleasure now to at least touch upon some of these topics with the equivalent to a rock star panel. So we have Rosi Braidotti, who's a distinguished university professor Emerita at Utrecht University. And I would refer to your app to see the full CV. It would take way too long, so I apologize to my colleagues that I will keep it brief. We have Torbjørn Fredriksen, who's the officer in charge and Division of Technology and Logistics at the UN Conference on Trade and Development. And Sir Geoff Mulgan, who's, among many things, a professor at the University College London. So a warm welcome. And if we may jump right in, and I was wondering, Torbjørn, whether I may invite you to kick us off. If you look at, from your perspectives, at the global state of play and the forces and dynamics we see against the backdrop of what we already mentioned in terms of technology development, science breakthroughs, but also huge societal challenges. What pictures do you see? Like, what are the things you're most worried about? Where do you see some sort of forces to the good, but also challenges?
Thanks, Urs, and hello, everyone. Let me start by saying that we were happy that the UN, and in my case, UNCTAD, is involved in this discussion. And I'd like to also express apologies from the Deputy Secretary General, who should have been here. We're having a ministerial meeting starting on Monday, and he had to help with certain things for preparing for that. I'm very happy to be here. You know, I think there are so many things that are happening that are presenting hope and perhaps concerns, because it's hard to tell exactly where this is all going. We're living in a time of profound change and transition. And I think to start with, we are seeing the urgency of the energy transition, which is undeniable, as also is the realities of climate change. We're seeing major geopolitical shifts in the world, which is redrawing alliances, and we're seeing a more multipolar world evolving. And between as well as within countries, we're also seeing growing inequalities. And this is leading to a more reinforcement of an unequal international order, where certain powers have much stronger influence on what we are going to do. And cutting across all these transformations, we have the rapid change of technology, from artificial intelligence to green hydrogen to gene editing. All kinds of frontier technologies are projected to grow so fast in the coming years, and we don't quite know exactly how this will play out. And the changes that we are observing, they are not happening incrementally. They're happening very fast and exponentially, and therefore will be also potentially very transformative. Of course, artificial intelligence stands a bit apart because it is a general purpose technology that can be used to amplify all other technologies. It accelerates innovation with potential to reshape economies and societies alike. And as with all disruptive forces, this means there can be great opportunities, but also great challenges and risks. So if I may just touch upon some of the positive ones with regard to AI, well, we see that as a clear potential driver of sustainable development. It can advance scientific discovery, improve healthcare, and support global responses to climate change, for example. It can boost productivity. We see that it is already boosting productivity in many areas by automating routine tasks, optimizing supply chains, and by increasing efficiency of various processes. For example, it's seen that intelligent irrigation management systems leveraging AI can reduce water use by up to 40%. That's a big number. Then, of course, on the flip side, there are many serious challenges. And let's first start with the environmental dimension of this. AI systems require huge computing power, energy, and water. The electricity demand from data centers is estimated by the IEA to more than double until 2030. The second challenge is limited to the very large digital divide that still applies to the world. Most AI-driven development is led by two countries, the US and China. It is only beginning at a very low level in places like most parts of Africa, for example. The third is the impact on work. It's estimated that up to 40% of all jobs globally could be affected by AI, with risks of displacement and polarization as middle-income roles decline. And finally, AI can reinforce bias, erode privacy, and entrench new forms of exclusion if access to technology remains unequal. So, bottom line, when it comes to AI and to many other things that we're talking about, it's very much a question of how we're going to manage this transition that will determine the outcome. So technology itself will not create problems or solve all the problems. It's a question of how we deal with it. And we need to in this context, have much better international cooperation, and we need to put the humanity at the center.
Thank you for setting the stage so beautifully. And if I may just ask a follow-up question that has two parts. The first, and you are already alluding to it, is how do you see the distribution of these challenges and opportunities around the world? Arguably, they're not equally distributed. Who are the bearers of the challenges and risks and harms versus those who benefit most from what you're describing in terms of advancements? And in addition to that geographic question, maybe we introduced the concept of planetarized humanity also in the radar, in the report, as one at different levels, right? Where you have individual level questions, you have societal level questions and planetary questions. And if you look at that layered model, what you describe, do you think some layers are more affected than others, or is it really simultaneously, this big question altogether, what does it mean to be human and the society and the planet under these challenging conditions?
Huge questions. I think it's very correct that the chances to influence and control what's happening is very limited, and knowing how to govern in this area is very difficult because most of the knowledge is concentrated in certain parts, not only geographically, but also in terms of stakeholders. It's very much the digital tech firms that are at the top, plus, of course, the scientific community. But the scientific community needs to be connected well to those that control governance. And I think that varies a lot from country to country, to what extent this is actually happening. So if you don't have strong government side, strong knowledge inside the governance framework, it's very difficult to know whether what is happening from the corporate side is what you really want to have in the end. So we have had a tendency, perhaps in the digital world, that every time there is a new technology, the main focus is how can we apply it to solve problems or to generate profits. When it's mainly the corporate side that is driving this, the profit motives will always be very strong. And it's not always that will be the same as what is good for humanity.
Got it. Thank you. So, Rosi, Torbjörn made an important, I think, statement that what we're experiencing right now may be a tipping point situation, right? Where suddenly things seem to go very fast, whether you look at global warming or climate change, or whether you look at any of the developments in technology that we talked about before. And so I'm now curious what your thoughts are. One of the, I think, innovations in this year's edition of the GESDA radar is that the role of social sciences and the humanities is emphasized and some sort of framed through this lens of planetarized humanity. And before we look into the future, I was just curious to hear your thoughts as a pioneer in the field in humanities and social sciences. How well have we done in the social sciences to anticipate what is happening and playing out right now? What's the track record of social sciences when it comes to anticipating the impact of technology or the interaction between society and technology?
Thank you so much. It's a great pleasure to be here and an honor and a lifelong dream to be at CERN. Can I just be a nerd and say I just took a picture of the building this morning and sent it to everyone I know? What an honor. Thank you so much. But times are hard, and the questions that we have raised are actually soul-searching. I completely concur with the diagnosis made so far. The accelerations of technology, environmental decline, and social inequalities is putting a burden on us all, a burden to understand. And my first reply to your question, Urs, is humanities and social sciences have really done their best to bring into focus what my favorite philosopher, whose name I will not tell you so you can guess, called adequate understanding of our condition. Understand it properly. And properly means together. in an interdisciplinary manner with a collaboration. There's wonderful concepts and notions and values we heard about this morning, totally important, all of them. Understanding adequately means facing an enormous degrees of complexity. And of course, that's our job. Here we are, GESDA, CERN. But what are we asking the average citizen to do? What are we plonking on their plate and say, deal with this, buddy? And I think this is where my concern is, not only as an educator, a lifelong pastoral care professor, but also as a normal citizen. We're actually asking everybody to become a philosopher, to think about what is at stake in being human. I mean, this is not something that a person in the street is used to. For us, it's a delight. Unleash me on this, I can speak for 6 hours on it. Not a fellow citizen. So something here is happening. The questioning of the human is a burden. It's something that happened as a result of a set of circumstances. I call them the post-human convergence. Edgar Morin calls them polycrisis. Call it what you want, but it's imposed. So I think one of the first things that we need to do, and here the humanities in particular have an enormous job to do, is actually make it digestible, break it into sizable chunks of knowledge and understanding. And I think that the radar, the idea of a mapping that would allow people to position themselves in the midst of what looks like chaos, but it isn't, because this is an incredible scientific revolution we're going through. These are amazing times. So making this acceptable, digestible, that is to say, working on the imagination, on representation, on language, on memory and history. Am I talking humanities or what? Too quick annotation, then you can shut me down. There are too many political forces in the world today that are exploiting the totally justified dismay and confusion of our fellow citizens for their own ideological purposes. Merchants of doom and gloom who do not help us understand, who increase the sense of powerlessness. It's too late, it's all played out, AI is doing everything. Not true, not true, not true. What is absolutely true is that we need to get activated, get involved in the process. We need to understand. We need to work on it together. The post-human future needs to be defined together. Second and last annotation, and this is a complicated one. Questioning the human. I come from the French School of Critical Theory. I graduated on the philosophies of Foucault and Deleuze. I've been a lifelong feminist. Dear friends, the human was never a neutral, universal term. Never. It was never one. Humanity has never been one. Only in the biggest delirium of Eurocentric humanism can you say there is one human. A critique of universalism doesn't make you a relativist. Don't make that mistake. I lived through postmodernism, I know. The opposite of universalism is not relativism. It's a plurality of situated perspectives. So the decolonial dimension is of the greatest importance to the conversation of what is happening to the human. It could not happen in a worse political context, where racisms of all kind and intolerances of all kind are on the rise everywhere. So have we got our work cut out for ourselves? But guess what? We can do it.
Excellent. Thank you, Rosi. Fantastic. So, Geoff, I'm curious, building up on Rosi's comments, if the social sciences and humanities and philosophy help us both to adequately understand the mess we find ourselves in, but also provide the tools of reimagination and rebuilding and responsible innovation and the like. What are the kind of institutions that we may need to build the future? I think Rosi also described that what we see in many parts of the world right now is not so encouraging in terms of national institutions. We see, of course, lots of challenges here in the international Geneva when it comes to international organizations. So you have done a lot of work both in the government and as an academic, and your focus is really on societal innovation. What's your thinking right now? What's needed in terms of taking some of the tools and imaginatory capacities that Rosi was talking about and building that future, or towards it at least.
Well, thank you, Urs. And I'll pick up on one word Rosi used, which was design. So we definitely need maps and to anticipate, but if we're not also creating options, then we just have wonderful analytics of disastrous situations, which is sometimes the situation of social science, I fear, around the world. We're in a very strange moment, as you all know. We've never been more planetary, but there's actually been more conflicts in the last 12 months than any time since 1945. So our capacity to cooperate, to coordinate, is probably getting worse and not better. So the one sort of thought I really want to put into this conversation, which you raised, Urs, is the role of institutions. I don't think values thrive if they just float freely. They've always thrived most if they're embedded in institutions. That could be religions, it could be universities for science, and it could be nations. You know, every nation state is based around institutions. And I think what we need desperately for the planetary is a new generation of institutions which embody all the values we're talking about here. If that is right, though, we have some fairly obvious problems. A lot of institutions were set up in the 1940s, a few in the 50s, a very few in the 60s. There have been more fragmentary ones in the last half century, from IPCC in the 80s to vaccine alliances, but it's a dwindling number. And we've lost confidence in creating new public institutions. At the same time, as Torbjörn said, the private sector has been creating global institutions. Google with Chrome, OpenAI, SpaceX, these are global institutions now spending probably 5 to 10 times as much on AI as the public sector. We don't even have the data to know. Over the last 2 or 3 years, I've been working with colleagues around the world trying to almost create a new practice of thinking about institutional design in the 21st century, because I think this is also an intellectual problem, that we've lacked the means, almost the language, the menu of options to think what would a planetary institution look like now. And so we draw a lot from the digital world, platforms, stacks, protocol-based organizations, and so on. And quite a lot from biology. Imagine institutions as swarms or coral reefs or myceliums, and that completely opens up your thinking. But most bureaucrats and governments around the world have never heard any of this. This is totally novel. It's not actually taught in universities either. And so the default is still, let's create a committee or a commission. And I'm afraid in most countries, science agencies and science funding bodies look almost exactly the same as they did 50 years ago. So there's a mismatch intellectually, in terms of money, in terms of power, between the public purpose and the private, and a failure of imagination and design. Now, I won't go on and on about it, but just to give 2 or 3 examples. If you look at the fields where planetary governance is glaringly needed, there are many, many of them, from space, where the last treaty was in the 1960s, to oceans, where we're making tiny bits of progress around plastics. AI, we still essentially have nothing at a global level to regulate or even establish strong standards. COP30 meets in a few weeks' time, and I'm involved in 2 projects trying to do a bit of institutional design around COP30, which may be pointers to some of the things we may need. One is very science-based, is looking at tipping points. You mentioned tipping points, Urs. You know, what might new institutions be at a regional level to monitor, spot, interpret tipping points like the AMOC switching, with enormous implications for the lives of hundreds of millions of people. We clearly need some new capability to do that, which isn't quite the same as the WMO or IPCC. And the second one, which is also will be sort of launched at COP, is the Global Citizens Assembly, trying to create a citizen's voice alongside the state's voice, the business voice, and the big NGO's voice, as a normal part of our dialogue about how to respond to things like tipping points. There are many, many other examples, but this is, I guess, my obsession now is how we move from the brilliance of social science and humanities doing critique and diagnosis, but if that doesn't translate into design and options, we become ever more fatalistic and ever more pessimistic about the world. And although this may seem completely unrealistic in the era of Donald, an era of sort of great power, assertion of might to return to borders and so on, I always point out that 10 years before the UN was created, it looked wholly utopian and unrealistic, which is now this is the time to work on the options which we will definitely need at some point in the near future.
Thank you so much. Very insightful. And if I may ask one or two follow-up questions, and then I would like to open up to hear your questions. So at GESDA, we hosted a workshop, a VLAR workshop, on this topic, Planetarized Humanity, and some of the questions that we discussed so far in this panel, and also the question how to move forward. And so I'm particularly curious, as you were describing the need for innovation in governance, innovation in the kind of institutions we build, some sort of a new design vision, right, for the institutions that are ready to meet the challenges of our time in a discontinuous future that we're headed towards. I was just curious, and maybe Rosi or maybe also you may have thoughts, where could be sources of inspiration for that exercise? I'm just personally throwing out as a maybe something to build on, that my feeling is that we may see more social innovation outside the Western world and more towards majority world countries, where you see, for instance, in communities, local experiments under constraints, right, born sometimes out of need, that may actually help us also to reimagine our more traditional institutions. Does that sound right, or where would you look for inspiration?
As somebody who has generationally and intellectually worked from the margin, about the margin, feminist philosophy being my main field really of academic activism, I would say that there are endless resources, even at the center, let alone in the margins, let alone outside the West, if we shift the perspective. I think changing the imaginary, creating horizons of hope, and I completely agree, Geoff, that we can't sink into the gloom and doom. That's a full-time political exercise, making people depressed and powerless. The sources of inspiration have to become part of a social practice, which is the creation of social horizons of hope. My favorite philosopher, again unmentioned, talked about joy, the ethics of joy, the ethics of affirmation. It's an activism. It's becoming active in the effort of overturning the conditions that are getting us down. Again, it's asking a lot of the average citizen to do this. The Spinoza approach picked up by Nietzsche, transmutation of negativity, picked up by Foucault, by Deleuze. This is heavy theory. Practically speaking, we need to actually indicate possible sources whereby the imaginary can be ignited. Literature, the arts, the minor discourses of philosophy. You know, philosophy can be immensely boring. It can also be an amazing archive of other voices, the voices of women, the voices of native, indigenous, colonized, decolonized people. There is a whole archive of other voices there. Erasmus of Rotterdam, In Praise of Folly, could have been written yesterday morning. We did recently a hip-hop version of that text in Rotterdam, where I work at the National Urbanism Institute, and we did a Black Dutch rendition of a hip-hop In Praise of Folly. If the younger generation don't know it, go and have a look at it. It needs to be put online immediately. An extraordinary text, 16-something. I mean, it's early modern times. Finding the kind of text and ideas that actually ignite your imagination. When did we fall out of love with the future in the Western world? When did that happen? When did we stop dreaming possible future? What's wrong with us? I finished my last book, is the last book I'll ever write, with a beautiful Australian expression, which is get a life. Not get a life, one life worth living. So I think a change of perspective, which we can do as leadership training, as education, I would say as a social program, whereby invigorating ideas are taught in the margin from the margin. Two other traditions, and I'll shut up. Feminist science fiction and Afrofuturism. If you haven't read Octavia Butler, people coming out of enslavement, dreaming possible future, then it's time to realize, and there we can look at the margins as sources of inspiration, that it is our turn now to cultivate the imagination. That's the task of the humanities, to train the imagination and to fall in love again with the possibility of futures. We are living through incredible times. Too bad that the burden of coping with the transition is pretty awful. It's a matter of and nor either or. But let's choose to get a life, please.
Very powerful. Please.
So I agree with all of that. And I mean, just picking up on Afrofuturism, there's a lot of strands around the world trying to fuse strands from literature with the practicalities of the present, especially cities in Africa, like Lagos, predicted to be 80 million by the end of the century. Khartoum could be 30 million. And that requires very different ways of thinking. And there's some quite crazy African sci-fi about what could happen to those cities. But on your specific question, Uz, we've precisely been trying to map cases which are relevant and inspiring from the last 10 years. Some quite global ones, things like very practical things like the International Solar Alliance, which is based in India, some very grassroots, indigenous-based, some combining humans and non-human animals into new institutional forms, some combining humans and technology into platforms. And with the UNDP, we published a lot of these case studies, which my guess is most people in this room will have heard of almost none of them. You've all heard of the private sector ones of the TikToks and the Alibabas, but the actual public-facing ones are almost unknown. So documenting them is key, using them as inspiration, and then having design methods which can help you design something new and useful for a practical problem, like what do we do about cross-border cybersecurity, let's say, or refugee flows, or stopping unnecessary wars. I mean, there's such a long list. So I really hope, maybe GESDA's next, radars help expand the imagination about what institutions could look like, because nearly all human progress has at some point depended on turning an idea of rights, an idea of whatever it may be, into an institutional form. That's my inner bureaucrat speaking, but I actually think it's true.
You inner designer.
Yeah, just one more thing, because ultimately all the innovation, all the ideas, all the good examples that we have, if we're going to have some kind of increased order of what we want to see, if it's possible, we need the governance angle to that, and we need the role of governments coming in. And what we're talking about is a very, as we call it, the planetarized humanity. It's a world now that is much more connected than it has ever been. And this means that we need solutions that are collaborative, forward-looking, and global in scale. And that's where an institution like the United Nations should play a very key role. The question is, why isn't it doing more than it should? And just to illustrate some of the challenges of fast technological change for policymakers, and policymakers at the global scale. We had here in Geneva the World Summit on the Information Society meeting in 2003, and then in Tunis in 2005. When you read the outcome document, which was a landmark thing, the word mobile phone is not mentioned once. A few years later, mobile phone was the only solution that we looked at. 20 years ago, there were about 100 gigabytes of data flowing on the internet per second. Today, we have around 380,000 gigabytes of data flowing every second on the internet. This is a completely different type of internet, different digital world. It's not easy for policymakers to keep up with this rapid change. We are very happy. I would like to recognize the ambassador of Gambia who's here today. He is the chairperson of the Commission on Science, Technology for Development, which is serviced by UNCTAD here in Geneva. It's the only place that can have a global discussion on what are we going to do with data governance. And data is the essential element for AI. So if we cannot crack that part, it's going to be very difficult to crack AI governance. So let's understand also the challenges that the governments are facing to deal with this.
Thank you so much. So we have 5 minutes and 39 seconds left. And I suggest we collect 2 or 3 questions, and then in the final round you pick one which you would like to answer. And I see Your Excellency has a hand up, so if we have a mic over here in the front, that would be helpful. And if we don't have a mic, then just please speak up.
Thank you so much for a very insightful
Microphone.
fascinating and insightful perspectives. I can't help but ask the question, since design was invoked, will our digital future be designed for us or without us? And connected to that, how can technology be harnessed truly to empower us from the global south, particularly in Africa, in addressing the systemic inequities and advancing sustainable development without exacerbating the digital divide, as well as eroding what I call cultural sovereignty? But thank you for your perspectives, and I look forward to your thoughts on that. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. Let's collect 2 more, if it's okay, just for the sake of time. Thank you, Eric. You please pick, because I can't see very well. Let's make sure we have some diversity balance as well. Yeah.
Okay, Bernard running a funding agency, and to Geoff, yeah, you're right. I can sing a song about why funding agencies still work the same as 20 years ago. But my questions are actually to you and Rosi. Rosi, about the shared values. What can social sciences, humanities do to fathom what we actually agree on? Because I think we need a base from which we can then build or design the institutions you are talking about. And to Geoff, my question is, how do you reconcile the conundrum of speed in technology and designing institutions that change quickly enough to accommodate for that speed?
Excellent. I think we have a lot of answers ready. And just be brief, if I may ask, given the time constraints. Who would like to start? Geoff, you want to start?
I'll start. So, first of all, on data, this clearly is the most important question in the world today. How do we govern data? At the moment, our data is mainly owned by US companies at a very large scale. But for me, the hopeful thing of the last 10 years is there's not only a very different Chinese alternative, but there's an Indian alternative, which is, we've taken more of our institutional creative ideas from India in the last few years than any other part of the world. What's being done on digital public infrastructure and platform thinking and so on, I think is ahead of Europe and ahead of the US, and is a partial answer to your question. It's a more empowering vision of the future, and also of how to design institutions which have a capacity to reinvent themselves. And this is the other crucial thing I want to mention, is Article 109, I think it is, of the UN when it was set up, which probably some of you will know. When the UN was created, I think it was Article 109, said every 10 years there should be a process to decide how the UN needs to be restructured to fit the priorities of now. That was last invoked in the 60s, 60 years ago. So we've essentially, we have, in a sense, stagnant institutions, because although the founders sense this need to constantly evolve as needs change, it became frozen. And I think part of the task of the diplomats of the world is to unblock it, perhaps to reinvoke Article 109.
Fantastic, thank you. Rosi?
I would combine quickly the 2 questions, because it comes to really one of the issues that haunts me, and that is, who are we who are actually concerned about this? If we say we ought, what is the digital future? Who decides? Is it going to be decided without us? Or if we say, what values do we share? We are assuming a common entity. My idea here is that that common entity is not to be taken for granted. It has to be constructed. It is a missing subject that we need to construct, and I love working with GESDA because I think it is constructing a milieu, a meeting ground. We who care for those issues have things to say about data sovereignty. I spend a month every year in Australia. I've grown up in Australia, and in Melbourne we work with the Aboriginal professors, chairs of Indigenous studies, on data sovereignty, how important it is to protect. And it is a whole horizon, but we who are asking these questions are already committed to a solution. We care, and we believe in democratic discussions. We know perfectly well that many of the big tech companies, and I will go to hell for this, and I'll never be able to travel the world, but I'm going to be straightforward anyway, do not believe in these issues. The big problem of the days is the disjunctions between cognitive capitalism and democracy. Palantir is run by a man with a PhD in philosophy from Yale by the name of Peter Thiel. And he does not believe in democracy. He specifically writes against liberal democracy. So we have here a struggle of ideas, which again puts the burden of philosophical thinking on each and every one of us. Let's not kid ourselves. There is a project here, which is not what His Excellencies was suggesting by saying, are they going to decide without us? If they can, yes, they will. Well, we're going to make sure that they don't, but it's a very strange situation whereby the greater forces of the market are actually against democracy. And so that the best asset that we may have now is forces within capitalism who actually believe in democracy, which happen to be in the minority. Can you believe it? What is happening to us? Marvelous time, difficult times. What a burden for all. Let's use our analytic power, our imagination, to try to make sense of it. Because some days, honestly, a glass of Prosecco is easier.
Very true, very true. Torbjörn.
If I may just, and I will build a bit on what Rosi said here. By the way, great rock star. The money doesn't solve everything, but money is badly needed if we're going to get more countries to capture the lost ground, to participate effectively in the digital future. And I just want to give you a number to reflect on. The top 7 companies of the world, according to market cap, they're all American tech firms, led by NVIDIA, which is more than $4 trillion of valuation now. They're worth about 21, maybe now 22 trillion dollars together. This is almost 100 times the amount of overall official development assistance from all the OECD countries to all the developing countries. Surely there would be ways to get some more money out to help developing countries catch up in this world. I think so.
Thank you so much. I hope you all feel invited to continue this conversation. As I mentioned early on, the topics are dense, are heavy, and so I would like to end with one final word per panelist, and that is, dear panelists, if you were to send a tweet to the future generation and you would have to pick an optimistic hashtag, what hashtag would you choose? Who would like to start? It's just one hashtag.
It's easy for me. I'm a feminist. Don't agonize, organize.
All right, thank you. Geoff?
Ditch fatalism.
Thank you.
Work together.
Work together. Thank you so much.
Thank you.